Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. Today is video 5 in my 355 Engine Out series, and today is a very special day because I'm actually going to be wearing shoes. No, kidding. Actually I'm wearing shoes, but we're going to be putting the motor back into the 355 today. So we got a lot of work ahead of us. I got a huge pile of all the parts here, a big pile of all the bolts on the table, and obviously we got to get everything buttoned up. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. We're ready to button up the valve covers real quick. If you have to refinish these, VHT makes the wrinkle paint, but the problem with the VHT stuff is it's just way too bright red. So I had my paint guy mix up a can of Rosa Perchetta 312, and I sprayed all this stuff. It's much more of a classy, elegant color, and it's actually much more correct to the regular color. In fact, that probably is the regular color. So anyway, we're gonna now put on the valve covers so we can be totally done with the engine, just to secure this up. So I've wiped down everything with alcohol. Another thing I did, maybe you don't have to, I took some good brand new clean oil, put it in a syringe, and I just kind of re-oiled all the tablets because they may have gotten wiped off. They may, when I bumped them with a rag or anything like that. And I just want everything to be oiled for the very first start. So sealing up the valve covers on these is slightly an art. They get installed dry. However, you're going to put a little bit of sealant at the corners, and I'll show you where I put it. So the factory Ferrari sealant is a white sealant. I don't think they use this stuff, but this stuff's actually really good. So this guy's just going to get placed back in this groove at the back. So basically there's a joint with the O-ring that is just prone to leak. So if we just kind of put a little bit of a goop near the O-ring and then kind of fade it out around the bolt, that's really all you got to do to seal up. I do put just kind of basically the slightest skim coat on the front facing. I don't want it to ooze out though, because it's really hideous if it leaks out. Now we're just going to do similar things here at the back. Just kind of fade it in. Don't forget this little guy. Just a little bit in the corners. All right, so last thing, take a tiny bit and kind of skim it in these. Almost like you're wiping your finger off. So now in these holes goes these little guys. So you want to make sure that these will stay in place and not pop out. So sometimes they fit in there nice and perfect. Other times they'll pop out. If they pop out, just stretch them out a little bit because they typically run just a tiny bit on the small side. So what I like to do is just like go and install them and stare at them for like 10 seconds. Make sure they're not moving, because last thing you want to do is be lowering the valve cover on here to find one popped off. All right, now that we're confident that all the gaskets are in there and nothing's going to fall off, we're going to sneak the valve cover in here. So back here, before everything sets up, we're going to want to go ahead and install the vacuum pump. Go ahead and shave off the little part of the gasket that hangs off. Now we got a gasket just kind of with a skim coat of sealant. Don't forget to put your gear back on. Okay, so we're back in the office here. We need to go ahead and get the covers and everything on there. Just to recap kind of what we did. Remember, we already timed everything. I didn't double check it. I didn't triple check it. I like centuple checked, or whatever you call it, everything. So these are torqued. I went through and kind of essentially made a checklist, because these obviously are very critical things. You don't want any of these pulleys to come off. We've double checked our 2.5 millimeters. I've turned the motor over quite a few times, rechecked them, made sure everything's good there. We've got our valve covers all torqued down and sealed up. So I am confident in the timing. I'm confident in everything that has to do with this. So we're ready to go and start taking stuff off. So we're done with our degree wheel. It just comes right off. I'm going to reinstall the tensioner. I think it's always been a joke between me and my friends that work on cars. Basically, like, you're getting close to the end of a project when like your whole garage or shop is just covered in tools and you're dirty, covered in oil. So we're going to take this pulley off because I've got a new one here. This is a common pulley. The bearing goes bad, especially after 22 years or whatever. So again, it's just one of those parts that while you're in there just kind of makes sense to replace. We'll kind of clean up around the area. All right, so we got a new pulley on there. Wouldn't it be convenient if I left this for the next guy? Remove our pointer. Just going to put a tiny smear of oil on the inside of the crank hub so it slides really nice. It can only go one way if you guys were curious. Going to put a little Loctite 242 blue on there. I think that's literally the only thing in the engine that requires any Loctite at all. And now lock the crank and torque it down. Next, I'm going to reinstall the covers, so don't forget about those little spacers we took off. Again, this is the point where you probably want to be very diligent. Well, like the whole job, don't drop anything. And these you can just snug up with an actual Allen wrench. Install cover number 2. We can reinstall our belts. We'll do the AC belt first. Well, we have to do the AC belt first. Now the alternator belt. We're going to go and tension the belt to our previously noted tension. Reinstall all the tubes to your intake. While it's super easy to access, we'll go ahead and do the filter. All right, now we can just slide in the idle air tubes. Tighten down those clamps. All right, so we are ready. It's time to lower the Ferrari. You guys laughed at me when I said we were lifting the Ferrari in that first video, but anyway, time to lower the Ferrari onto the motor. I've went through and double, triple checked everything, especially the stuff I can't add to. So all the clamps are tight, everything's tight. The only thing I didn't do now is the spark plugs. We're gonna wait to do that until everything's back together because I wanna have the spark plugs out. We're gonna turn the motor over to kind of prime it to make sure the oil kind of gets circling since everything is now dry right now. And so I'd rather have a nice, I want oil pressure when we first start, not have any delay. Anyway, let me go get this set up on a tripod and let's lower this down. Now we can just install the back bolts. Favorite Ferrari tool. And then the last two we're going to do is the ones up in the wheel arch. I'm not going to tighten these down until everything else is done, but it's always a good idea to just get everything threaded before you even tighten anything down. All right, now we've got the bolt holes mostly lined up. Should be able to finger tighten most of them. So we'll go ahead and get all these threaded before we actually cinch any down. This is where a gear wrench is really your best friend. Most of these bolts you can get with a torque wrench, and we're just going to torque them down. So don't have to wrench on it for hours. I'm just going to use an impact to kind of tighten it. I'm going to get everything snug, and then we're going to go back and torque everything to spec. Okay, everything's tight. So I suppose as long as the engine doesn't come falling out, it's a success. Sweet. Whew. All right, so everything's bolted in place now. The subframe didn't fall out. Time to start putting all the parts together, and then hopefully we'll be able to drive this later today. Now we can essentially just do this in like reverse order of how the engine came out. Everything's pretty simple, so we're going to start by hooking up the parking brake and then all the hydraulic lines to make sure everything kind of gets sealed up. Now parking brake. Now I just kind of put it to where we took it off from, but you can easily adjust this if you think it's dragging at all or the handle comes up too far. Now I'm going to put some new O-rings for the AC parts and go ahead and reinstall them.
I really need some stubby versions of these big long wrenches, but whatever, it's working.
Now I'm just going to reinstall the shift rod, and if you want to know how to adjust this, I actually have a really good video. I'll link it in the description or maybe in this top corner, so just check it out. All right, so now we've got a vacuum being pulled over here, so now we're going to move our attention back to the back. So while the car is low, we're going to go ahead and start hooking up the front of the motor. Again, we're waiting to do the exhaust till the end because this makes a perfect place to stand so you can actually do all that stuff. Otherwise, if this was here, you literally have to lay on top of everything, which is very uncomfortable, and it's very, you know, you're laying on top of plastic manifold. So we got some of our old hoses, which are only 2,000 miles on them. And we got a new pack of hoses we're going to go through and go ahead and get them installed onto the car. I didn't know if I actually showed this when I did the engine removal, but basically this is where I stand, kind of right in where the exhaust normally goes, and it gives you good access to be able to lean over and get to the stuff without having to actually physically lay on top of anything. I like to start with the power steering fluid because it's the most likely to leak, I guess, if you bump a pipe. Just make sure you don't leak any of these fluids on your brand new belt. Then I move over to the main hoses. Couple good tips on them. Just make sure when you put on those main hoses, you're shoving them far enough in that you can get a really good grip with the hose clamps. Don't forget your throttle cable. Then we're going to hook up our reservoir here, and then after the reservoir, onto the fuel line. So just make sure you get those all the connections snugged up really good, and then the fuel block, obviously don't drop a tool or anything down here, so be careful there. Took a break from dinner now that I'm all clean to kind of finish up the inside, so go ahead and pull this grommet through, and we're going to get everything plugged back in and just tuck them all in to make them pretty. Make sure you're not about to squish any wires with the... All right, the cover is all buttoned up. So we've done the front of the motor, some of the side stuff, but we need to get it back in the air to finish it. So the last thing to do real quick is this thing. The pump has been off for about an hour and a half now, and we're still at 30 degrees of vacuum. So I'm comfortable with our seals. And so we're gonna go ahead and disconnect the pump and then get the car back in the air. All right, so in the passenger side wheel well, we've already attached the brake line over here with the P-clip, the ground. I already did these two because they were leaking all over the place. So now we got to still do the oil tank bolt and the top oil tank line. So up here at the top, I put the grommet through, grommet on the other side. You can fall off by holding it. Again, don't forget about your ABS lines. And don't forget the top oil tank bolt. So next thing is going to be putting the exhaust on, but real quick first, we're going to go ahead and just do all the wiring harnesses, get them back together since they're kind of all over the place. So I could guess and probably get it right, but I'm literally going back and looking at pictures of just the orientation of where these wires went, just so it can be exactly the way it was before, just so there's no trial and error about it. So again, while it might look intimidating, everything can only plug in one spot, and that's why we took before pictures. So now it went exactly the way it went when it came off. And then lastly, while we're here, we'll go ahead and install the O2 sensors and the thermal probes. So now I've replaced both of the EGR pipes with new silicone pipes because the old ones are busted up. So now we can reinstall our EGR system. So I dropped the clamp. There it is. Down here, don't forget about your bypass valve connection. It goes in right there. So one thing I've never noticed, so you got your positives here, then they have one little thing here. I guess this is where you would jump start your car or hook up a big charger. I've never noticed this ground right here, so that's kind of cool. And then last thing down here we need to do is plug in our thermocoupler ECUs. So I of course labeled them top right and bottom left. Next thing we're going to do is go and hook up the whatever you call it, the bypass pipe. I bought new I guess manifold gaskets because the old ones just simply looked old. This guy slides in here like this. Just grab the bolts. Now, it's kind of up to you and your own trial and error to kind of figure out which orientation works best so you can get tools on them. Doesn't really matter as long as you can tighten them down. All right, and now we're ready to put on the muffler. Okay guys, so now it's time to put on the sound system on the 355. So kind of going to be showing you how to do this too. I'll probably make a standalone video for this eventually, but basically what we're going to need to do is leave everything kind of loose, because the aiming of the tips is kind of the tricky part, I guess. So right now we have the manifold and the Y pipe all loose. We're going to put this on there, and then once the bumper's on, we're going to position it and then tighten everything down. So anyway, let's go ahead and get this in the car. All right, so we're going to start by lifting the Capristo into its general location. Okay. Once it's there, we can now install one of the bolts just to kind of hold it into place without the bypass there. And now we can come over here and start installing all this hardware. And I guess technically you could have installed this before, but I always find that it kind of gets in the way. But now that the muffler supported on the side, we can take the weight off again and install the bypass valve. I'm just going to snug that up a little bit so it doesn't move. We still have a little bit of rotation adjustment that we can do. Anyway, so now let's move on to the bottom and we'll try to get everything else lined up. So now underneath the car we can put on our whatever these are. They're kind of like a V-band clamp, but they're more substantial. So with everything loose, you should be able to move the muffler around to get them to line up. So install the clamps on both sides, and it's okay to go ahead and tighten these down. Okay, so now it's time to install the bumper. Like I said, make sure you put that masking tape on there. Otherwise, you risk kind of scratching your car up as this slides in. So, with the masking tape, makes it an easy one-man job. So the proper body gap right here is 10 millimeters, and it actually, the idea is that it matches the rest of the car's, you know, little line that it has here. So you don't need to try to get it to sit up flush. You really won't be able to anyway. So what we're going to do is get it up. We're going to kind of set this side first, and then set it on the other side, and then set this part separately. So here, I'll show you what I mean. So what I do is, honestly, eyeballing it is probably your best bet. So I just put my drill on there, and then kind of get it close. Okay. Now we're going to go over the other side, and we're going to make sure that the gap here to here and here to here is the exact same on either side. All right. So now looking at the back, I can see that there's a very consistent, even gap. So the next step is pretty easy. Now that this side is cemented in place, we can simply just adjust this to make it an even gap all the way across. So remember, the goal is to have this line match this line over here. So now with the Capristo on, we've got all the bolts loose. So like I said, we have the actual muffler mounts loose up here. We got the bypass loose, as well as both the header and the cap bolts loose. And so what that lets us do is everything can move around. So what I did is I moved the tips exactly where I want them. So my goal is to be completely centered inside each of the vents. I like them kind of tucked up high personally, and it kind of gives you a nice uniform look all around. You also can adjust the distance. So we're looking for exactly, you know, maybe, you know, it looks like it's like 3/4 inch there, 3/4 inch there, you know, there's a curve of bumper. So I did use the jack. I'm not lifting anything with the jack, but I'm simply using it to hold the muffler in place, because you can actually move it around. So once it's all in place, all you simply got to do is just tighten everything down, and in theory it will stay. It might come down, I guess maybe 1/4 inch, but once you tighten it, everything does generally stay exactly in the same spot. So before I tighten these, you'll notice that these are actually springs that the muffler's mounted on. I kind of put a tiny bit of preload on them, maybe like 10 pounds of force down on this bracket before I tightened them. But anyway, now we're going to go through and just go ahead and tighten all the other bolts, and the muffler will be fully supported. Well, it's now dumping rain outside, so I don't know if we're going to be able to drive it, but we'll be able to start it. So it is time to go ahead and put all the fluids in here that we need. Okay guys, for you guys that are still watching, we're almost done. Gonna prime the motor right now. So basically, if you guys remember, I didn't install the spark plugs yet, and that was intentional because I wanted to prime the motor, which means with no resistance in the motor, with the spark plugs out, I want to turn it over a couple times because the oil tank was dry, the oil cooler's dry, the oil sump was dry, everything was dry. I just don't want it to start and run for like 10 seconds while the oil's waiting to go there. So if you turn it over no resistance, that's a good way to kind of prime the motor. That was actually surprisingly quick. Just within maybe 10 cranks, it already had oil pressure. So that's a good thing. Anyway, so we got our spark plugs here. The factory gap is 28. The old plugs were exactly 28. So I just got to make sure the new plugs, which appear to be like 27, go to 28. Now we're just going to go ahead and install all these Allens, tighten it down, and this side is done. And guys, just look how good that Rosa Barchetta paint looks, better than just the bare VHT. Came out really, really sharp. So we have oil, power steering, coolant. We need to do the clutch and brakes. Luckily, they're on the same reservoir, because remember we opened up all the lines back here. So we're going to go ahead and top off our reservoir. This is pretty much the only way you can do the clutch, and it's the easiest way to do the brakes. So we're going to go ahead and fill this guy up with about half of this and bleed everything out. So if you've never used one of these, they make doing anything with hydraulic stuff like brakes so easy. We're just going to go ahead and put in about, I don't know, 12 psi or so. So normally, of course, you're going to want to bleed the closest to the reservoir and back. But since the lines were open in the rear, we're actually going to do it twice. We're going to bleed the rears, and then we're going to bleed the fronts, and then go back to the rears, just in case there's like an air bubble right at the place where they tee off. And we're also going to do the clutch at the same time. I'll show you how to do that. Always have a bunch of rags close by. It really helps to put a flashlight here. Then you can always just visually check to make sure that it never ran dry. Keep checking your pressure. Now the fronts. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is bleed the clutch. So I have this little dust cover on there. You don't need one, but I like to put it on there. We need to get a little hose on there, open this up. We're going to let it bleed till there's no air bubbles. Then I'm going to cycle the pedal a few times, and then we're going to bleed it one more time, and that'll ensure that there's no air in the system at all. All right, so it appeared my last hose finally tore and went to be with the Lord. So anyway, got a new one. Oh yeah, you can see all that. Lots of air bubbles coming out right now. All right, so I've cycled the clutch a bunch of times. And so now we'll crack it one more time. See, a few more air bubbles are coming out. There's fluid in here in the slave cylinder, so when you cycle it, some of those bubbles come back out. Anyway, it looks like we're doing pretty good now. Okay, like I said, I'm exhausted, I'm dirty, my shop's a mess, but everything's back in there. So I've gone through, I've double checked everything, made sure I got every clamp tight, make sure everything's topped off, got oil in there. So go through like kind of a mental checklist in your head. I got the coolant cap off because I'm going to watch the coolant level. It should get sucked down there, and I got a 10mm on the bleeder. So we're going to go ahead and start it. I've already known that there's going to be oil pressure just from when I kind of started it without the spark plugs. But anyway, the only other thing we gotta do is obviously plug back in the fuel. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna crank it up. Is this the part where we cross our fingers? Yes, so. All right, here we go. Neutral. Car can't really go anywhere. no leaks right now. It sounds great, it's purring good. There's no stumbles or misses. I'm just going to keep checking for any leaks, obviously, for the power steering, and keep kind of checking off the fluids. Also going to check the oil here in a few minutes when it gets a little warmer. In the meantime, I'm going to go open the garage door before I pass out. At first I heard this loud rattling and I'm like, what is that sound? But it's actually these guys rattling. It scared me at first. Anyway, motor's running fine. We haven't found any leaks or anything like that. And so all we need to do is kind of finish up the AC. We should be good to go. Real quick double check. Temperatures look good. AC is getting cold. Motor is back in the 355. I love how I redid the plenums and the valve covers. Before they were that bright VHT. Right now they're more of a much more darker, the Rosa Bruschetta that I misted over the top. So I'm actually very happy with it, the way they came out. Those valve covers just look fantastic or whatever down there. All right, guys, finally we are done with the car. So everything is good. I've ran it for about 30 minutes off and on to get the AC charged and just to double check everything. It took a while to get the coolant nailed down. It just seems like you can't pour all the coolant you need in there. You kind of top it off, it drains into the radiators, you run it for a few minutes, you let it cool, and then kind of once it's cool, it'll take some more. Anyway, I knew that I drained about 1.5 gallons out, so I knew I had to put in about 1.5 gallons more, and initially it only would let me take in about just over a half gallon. So anyway, watch the temperature gauge very closely. I did run into an issue off camera that took me a while to figure out. I didn't film it because I was probably cussing and frustrated. But anyway, it developed a leak and right at the bleeder valve for the coolant. And so I had to wait for everything to cool off and basically like clean up the little copper crush washer because it had a little, crusty water on there or whatever from previous times. Anyway, it's gone. We verified that everything's good. So now we're just ready to button everything back up. So got to put on the last of the engine trim pieces. I'm gonna hop underneath the car and go ahead and put on all the body panels. And then as soon as these roads are dry, gonna take this guy for a drive. You know you're close when you're mounting the wheels. All right, so now I used to have my wife help me put the lid on there. What I kind of do to set these up is just make these snug enough that you can actually move it, but it stays in the place. Once you're confident that you got it in a good place, you can remove the guards. Don't just slam it down because you're probably not going to align, but go ahead and carefully bring it down. And then just check your alignment all the way down so you don't nail any paint. So obviously I got a gap over here, not over here. So I'm just going to pull out on that side. And then we can also just check the alignment because everybody likes nice even gaps everywhere. So once I'm happy with it, all I got to do is it should stay in place and then tighten it down. Here's a little pro tip for you. You want to know the easiest way to get the trunk screws? Sit in the trunk. So I always thought trunks had to have a handle to get out, but there is not one in here. So if you ever get locked in this trunk, I think you're SOL. It is pretty rewarding to actually complete a big project like this. All right, sitting at a light, oil temperature is 210, water temperature is 180, oil pressure is good. What is that, 35? Okay, so the major is done, everything's working out great. Temperatures are great, the car's running perfect. all that hard work at least ends up in a lot of smiles. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching.